What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 226 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about yet another autobiographical graphic novel. This is Epileptic by David B. David B is not his given name. He was born and named Pierre-Francois Bouchard, and I'm sure that I butchered that a little bit, and I apologize. But when he was 14 or 15, I think, he changed his name to David B, and he actually covers that a little bit in the book. You get to see him explain why he changed his name. But this story is about how David's older brother had epilepsy, and how that impacted the entire family, and how it influenced a lot of the decisions that people in the family made. How they would move to a different city because there was a healer who lived there, and they were thinking, well, maybe he can help him with his epilepsy. And how basically everyone in the family, their life was changed in some way by David's older brother having epilepsy. And it's a very honest book, a lot like Fun Home. I'm not sure if this book would be as honest if David's brother was a little bit healthier. Now, this is not exactly like Fun Home. In Fun Home, Alison Bechdel's father died when she was in college, and I asked the question, would she have been as brutally honest with her autobiographical story if he was still alive? Here, David B's brother, his life is basically ruined by epilepsy. His grandmother even suggested that maybe David's brother was mentally retarded as well as epileptic. And so, by the time you get towards the end of the book, where you get to see David's brother, and you get to see just how far this disease has gone in ruining his life, he's not really capable of taking care of himself, and he's not really the same person that he was when they were kids. He seems considerably not really all there, and you have to wonder, was his grandmother true? Was she speaking truly? Was he a little bit mentally retarded, or was it just the epilepsy that kind of took its toll on him? And the book kind of leaves it open. But you have to wonder, would David be as honest with this book if his brother was capable of understanding what kind of book he was doing and what all he was saying? Because there's some parts of this book that are very harsh. Like at one point, he talks about how he fantasized about killing his brother, and that's stuff that I would not put that in an autobiography. I would not admit to that. I've never actually fantasized about killing anyone in my family. I just want you guys to know that. But if I had, I would not put that in an autobiography. And furthermore, we know that his parents have read this, because at different points, he will stop the narrative, like say, whenever he's in his early 20s, he will stop from that point, and then he will flash forward to the present day where he's in the middle of writing this book, and he will say, I let my parents read this excerpt of the book, and they had some comments to offer. And he's kind of jumping forward and backwards in time. It's more or less a straightforward linear story, but occasionally it will jump to whatever the present day is at that point, and I'm sure it took him a few years to do this, so he would jump forward to whatever the present day was at that moment to mention, well, my mom had this to offer, or my dad, he added this little insight to this particular incident that I'm talking about. And I like that. That's very interesting, because most of these autobiographies, they are just going from point A to point B. They're going in a fairly linear, straightforward method. There is one autobiography that I talked about a few years ago that was somewhat fictional, but also an autobiography where the author was putting forward this idea that if she had a time machine, she would go back to earlier points in her life and try and fix certain things that happened. And that was an autobiography that also had fictional elements to it. So it's not exactly the same as some of these that I've been talking about for the last few days. I talked about it on my channel, but I can't even remember the name of it. It had something to do with time travel, though. But anyway, this book, I like it quite a bit, and unlike some of the others that I've talked about recently, which all have a fairly straightforward art style that is fairly realistic, Fun Home and Safe Area Garage, both especially have a pretty realistic style. Persepolis is a little bit cartoony, but it is still pretty straightforward and realistic in its depiction of what's going on. This book actually goes pretty far out there and has some really strange stuff going on, some very surreal depictions of the events here. Sometimes it gets a little bit trippy, almost feels like David B. Was tripping on something whenever he was doing some of this. I'm not saying that he was, but it kind of feels like that. This is the most out there out of all of the autobiographies that I've read and talked about recently so far. But I like this book quite a bit. It is very long. If you have like a week or two to kill, you could probably read this in that time. This is probably one of the longest ones that I've talked about so far. Actually, it may be about as long as Persepolis, but Persepolis feels a lot shorter than this book. This one feels very dense, and it's not something that you can just breeze on through. And I will say, much like the subject matter with Safe Area Garajda, the subject matter here is not a happy subject matter. With Persepolis and Safe Area Garajda both, you kind of felt like you were getting a little bit of a happy ending at the end of both of those, even though both of those were about some pretty serious stuff. With Fun Home, which I forgot to mention that yesterday, but Fun Home and this, you don't get nearly as much of a happy ending that is kind of added on at the end. It feels a little bit more in line with the tone of the rest of the book. So if you like the more somber, real talk stories that are out there, then you will probably like this quite a bit. I like this, but it's not something that I intend on rereading a whole lot, just because it is pretty heavy in places, and it's very harsh in places, and that's not something that I want to bring into my soul whenever I'm reading something. I like to try and enjoy what I'm reading. So this is something that, while I think it is very necessary to read, especially if you know people who are differently abled, for example, if you have a friend who has epilepsy, you may not even know that they have epilepsy. That's something that's covered at one point in this book. When David was in college, he was talking with some people, and one of them said, well, I have a friend who's epileptic, and they take care of it just fine, so I don't really know what's going on with your brother, David. And it's one of those things where he realized that the disease was different for different people. And that's something that I think is very important to realize. For example, not to try and put myself out there, but I have diabetes. I mentioned that on the channel a long time ago, and a lot of people, they will say, oh, okay, my grandmother has diabetes, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's not the same diabetes. Your grandmother can control it with diet and exercise. I have to take shots, and if I don't, I will die. So it's one of those things where reading this is very helpful in helping people who don't have to struggle with some kind of disease understand that the struggle is different for different people. Maybe your epilepsy is something you can very easily manage, and maybe it's something that will tear your family apart and almost ruin the lives of everyone in your family. I feel like I could get away with saying that in the case of this book. But it's very much a book that I feel like people should read, even though it's not an enjoyable book, if that makes any sense. So those are my thoughts on Epileptic. I hope that you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.